Well, good afternoon, everybody. Excited to be here again. Today we are going to talk about a new product at ProcessMaker. It's a workflow microservice orchestration API in the cloud focused on software vendors. So I think you'll see it's a change from our previous product. So just to give you a little context, ProcessMaker is known for its BPM suite. That is a low-code BPM suite, as we talked about this morning. It's got everything you would expect: forms designer, process designer. And it's got a great market, and it's taken us to where we are today. It's known as a very simple way to develop processes. But now we're disrupting our own product by offering a workflow microservices API in the cloud. And we're excited about this new market that represents. So the big question is why? How did we get into this market? So we started off about 5 years ago developing some OEM process engines. And over the last four or 5 years, we've embedded our engines in 2 of the top 20 ERP vendors in the world and 1 of the top 10 CRM vendors in the world. And while we were doing that, we realized that the sort of BPM suite is not usually the best approach. There's a lot of baggage that you're carrying around with the sort of low-code environment, and it's really about this modularity that Nathaniel was talking about. So we noticed that if you're a software vendor, I'm talking CRMs, ERP, billing systems, you do usually have a concept of a workflow in your product, but it's a very singular concept. They're not people that are working in our environment today. And then suddenly a customer, the first enterprise customer comes along, and they want to do something different, something much more complex. And that usually starts taking the software vendor down a rabbit hole to try and accommodate that vendor or that customer. Or maybe the customer wants to add in what we know as that approve reject moment, which is not so common in the sort of typical transactional application that everybody tends to build. So this is really the problem that we started solving about 4 or 5 years ago. And we've come up with a term for that. We call it workflow, the 8.5% product problem. Why do I say that? It's because, like Nathaniel was talking about modularity, we call it a feature versus product. Is workflow really a product, or should it be a feature in another product? And if you're forced to buy a workflow solution next to your CRM or your ERP, it's because of a fundamental failure in that other product category. So we're still arguing whether it's 8.5% or 9.5%, but we like to look at it as the feature that's missing in those products. So what is our solution? It's a highly scalable, highly fault-tolerant, BPMN 2.0 compliant workflow microservice. It's in the cloud. It's an always-on, very simple, very much lean service in the cloud. So what does it consist of? First of all, it's an engine. We'll talk a little bit about that. It doesn't have other parts, but we do have a designer, so there's a little bit of an exception there. And it's a connector suite. And so those are the 3 main parts of the solution. So first of all, the engine. This is a REST microservice in the cloud. It is BPMN 2.0 compliant, so we can load up a BPMN file from any editor. We do not ship with a BPMN editor. There is no editor. But you can also create processes programmatically, and we think that's going to be the choice for a lot of developers. It's got SDKs in every major language. It's fully cloud scalable, and the script tasks also represent a serverless cloud compute option. So think about sort of Lambda, but we're doing it in Node.js and Lua. The connectors, all of these connectors that you see are currently live. If you go to our GitHub repo, and Taylor will show you that in a moment, you'll see these. These are completely open source. So you can quickly copy one of the connectors, make your own connectors, load up your connectors into the GitHub repo. We'll pull that right from the BPMN file and load it into the engine to execute. So you can see we focused on some interesting ones there already: IBM Watson, blockchain, and then some of the typical ones you would expect as well. The designer, this is the designer. So we've built BPMN designers, we have other designers, and we decided specifically if you're a CRM, an ERP, a billing system, you do not want a BPMN designer. As we all know from the raging debates about that over the years, we believe you want something simple. This is 100% JavaScript, Vue.js, highly embeddable, totally skinnable, and it's a completely permissive open source license. So Apache 2.0 open source license, so the ISV can really take ownership, skin it, template it, and embed it in the solution. So just a quick example, we want to call a form a webhook to start a process. We just call a simple webhook. It generates the webhook with the environment from our cloud, and that could be called, say, from a form or from Slack. Again, that's an independent forms layer, and then on the next user task, 2 API calls, and we pull down the case that's pending, and then we submit data to update it. right? So very simple interface, very lean workflow as a microservice. So I will hand it over to Taylor. That was fast.
That was really fast. Thank you, Brian. This is my first year at BPM Next, so thank you, everybody, for the welcome. For some of you, it's really refreshing not to have to explain BPM for the 800th time. So as Brian mentioned, ProcessMaker.io is in the cloud. It is live now as a public alpha, so you can go to ProcessMaker.io right now, sign up, and give it a whirl. Follow along if you'd like. As Brian mentioned, we talked a lot about low-code, no-code solutions so far in the demos that we saw. This is very much a high-code solution. This is meant for developers who want to embed workflow functionality into their existing product, but don't want to reinvent the workflow wheel. So again, ProcessMaker.io is there. We do have resources to make things easier for you to understand this concept and get started. We have blog articles and things like that. So if I do cover a topic that is very, very quick and you want to know more, usually that information is in our blog. We do have a rich API, as Brian mentioned, in most major languages. We do use OpenAPI, so you can, if you have something that can consume OpenAPI, it's very easy to consume. As Brian mentioned, we do have SDKs in most major languages. And if you're using something exotic like Erlang or something like that, obviously we do have a REST API that you can go ahead and call directly. I'm going to go through a couple more things before we go into the demo. As Brian mentioned, we do have a GitHub where our SDKs are open source. So by all means, if you're a developer or you're just interested, pull up our GitHub repo. Take a look at it, and I'll show off the connectors a little bit after the demo. So for our demo, I know that we've been talking about the GDPR a couple times during the conference, and so it is definitely high on our mind. One of our previous engagements, Data 443, they just did a press release today, demonstrating that they are going to be providing some of their GDPR workflows powered by ProcessMaker.io to their customers. So we're going to be showcasing a little bit what the POC that we built for them in order to get their buy-in and kind of walk through that. So this is a DSAR request. So that's a data subject access request. For those who are not familiar with it, this is so that a customer or even an employee can basically request what PII data a vendor may have on them and then review that data and then optionally ask the vendor to remove such data. This is in, obviously, a BPMN format. However, this can be done, as Brian mentioned, through a BPMN editor or programmatically. So through the API, you can programmatically create the BPMN constructs and wire them all together. We feel that ISVs that are creating custom workflows for their customers dynamically at runtime would use the API. So we can see a multi-lane process here. Our start event, which is fetching some information from the customer coming in. We are showing a Slack connector, which is one of the many connectors that we have. Normally, this would potentially go through email or something like that, but we are showcasing Slack as one of those example connectors that we use. This has no interface embedded in it. In fact, we would assume that the customer who's using ProcessMaker.io would create their own interface in whatever tooling they have. So if this was a mobile company, obviously they're potentially using native mobile platform tools, or if it's a web-based company, they have a web interface. For this demo, we will showcase some really bad engineering designed HTML to showcase a custom interface. And we'll kind of revert back to this diagram as we go through the demo. Here I am logged in to ProcessMaker.io, and this is something that, again, you can do right away, sign up. We have here multiple environments. This is a one-click launch kind of style where once you launch an environment, that environment is a sandboxed, isolated, high-performance workflow engine in the cloud. It has its own scaling rules. Its data is isolated from other environments in your account. You can see that we've already launched environments for various demos that we kind of run. Here we have already launched our DSAR demo. And here's the dashboard for that environment so we can see how many processes we have launched in this environment, how many token transitions, which I'll kind of explain later on, and then some additional meta tools that we can use to kind of dig into the operational functionality of that environment. And I'll go back to this interface as we go through the demo. So to kick off this example request, here is a sample HTML form that we generated just using standard HTML and standard JavaScript. This is obviously not the interface that this customer would use. Maybe they're building something for an internal portal or through a mobile app to make it easy for their customers. But the point is, it should be relatively simple for you to build a custom UI and then launch a process in ProcessMaker IO. So basically this JavaScript call to call the web service or through the webhook URL, as Brian mentioned, should be all that's necessary to launch the request. So I went ahead and pre-filled this data out, so I'm going to go ahead and submit this. And we can immediately see that we got a new message in Slack for that request. Now, obviously, this might be delivered to the customer's internal team or even to an internal queue or ticketing queue or something like that, but I can see how quickly it notified Slack through our workflow engine. So the internal employee would then click on this, and as Brian mentioned, this is, again, simple JavaScript that called the ProcessMaker IO API and fetched pending case list and then pulled down a relevant information. Obviously, there was one case pending. And so the agent is reviewing it, says, maybe I need to request clarification from the requester about your address. Maybe it doesn't look correct. And then I'll submit it. And then an email might have been sent back to the customer to say, hey, can you please clarify your request? Going back to this, we are kind of at this stage, right, where we are going through this loop for clarification from the original requester. Let me go back here. So this is from the customer's perspective. I say, you know what, this was absolutely incorrect, so I'll go ahead and update that and submit it. And so the request goes back to the internal agent. The internal agent reviews it and says, you know what, that looks good. Let's go ahead and submit that. So in the process, we've gone past this part, and we would have flowed here to where we say response from class of docs, where it might have been like the internal data repository that the customer had. This would be a script task that calls maybe some internal services to gather that PII records that the customer may have of the requester, and then populate the case data with that, and then notify Slack, and then allow the customer to review that PII data. So let me go ahead and do that. So this is from the agent's perspective and saying, hey, we have this potential personal data of this customer. Let's go ahead and keep these items and then submit. And so now the request is going back to the customer to review that PII data and say, hey, what do you want to do with this PII data? Is it okay if we have it, or would you request that they remove it? So the customer would see this. Now again, this is all simple JavaScript API, completely custom. It's not driven, the UI is not driven by ProcessMaker IO. The customer has the full functionality of customizing this interface any way that they want. I'm going to be the customer that says, you know what, I don't like this data, so I'm going to go ahead and request that you remove it. And you can see the response time. It's almost near instantaneous, right? So the workflow engine is meant to be very, very lean on passing this around. And from the agent's perspective, I see this request from the customer and says, okay, I need to remove this PII data. So what happened in the original process was that we went ahead and did this throw, which is now firing off a sub process here. If we go back to our ProcessMaker engine, I'm going to take a moment to kind of explain what's going on here. We can see a few things. One is we can see our list of processes that are defined in this workflow environment. So process 1 would relate to this top level process, and then we can see this follow-up process that is related to this bottom lane here. And in the workflow environment, we can see how many instances of those processes and the state of those instances there are. These are unique identifiers that identify that process inside the workflow engine. You might refer to these identifiers in your SDK calls, and then when this was last updated and what is the current state of it. We can also look at tokens and what are the active tokens that are happening inside this process. So we can see where we are in the transition of that process. So I'm going to go ahead and complete this real quick. And we can say now that the process is completed, I've successfully removed the PII data that the customer wanted. So if we go back to our workflow environment here, now again, this UI kind of looks like an engineer designed it. That's absolutely true. But the customer might have a portal that is consuming the API and presenting this information to their customers or to their internal staff. Everything that is in this UI is API driven. So when we are looking at the logs of the workflow execution engine, we have a lot of transparency into how the engine operates. So you can see through every token transition in the process, we have an extreme amount of metadata to help analyze the performance of the process execution, what data was passed around, where is the token going, and all of this is available through the API. And it's a real-time reporting API, which is very, very important. And then we can see token transitions, which is more of a high-level view of those token transitions as well. So the logs show the actual detailed workflow logging, and then this shows a little bit more of an abstract token transition kind of log. For software vendors, usually they will have some BI platform to collect data from all their various tooling. So our workflow environments can actually pass all of this log data over to whatever logging environment you may already have in place. We have some other additional features in the workflow environment, such as Secure Vault. So as you have process designers in your organization, you might be building out processes that have to communicate to secure systems. So obviously you don't want to embed passwords or credentials in your process map. So we have Secure Vault here where you can create your own secret key value pairs and then embed those into your process maps. That is also something that is pretty nifty in my opinion. So going back to this process map, we saw that we are utilizing the Slack connector here and in various places. We have the concept of script tasks, which allows customers to embed scripts written in either Lua, JavaScript, Java coming up, and executing them in line with the process execution, or potentially referring to an external connector, as Brian mentioned. So if you do go to our ProcessMaker GitHub, you will see in our PMIO Lua connectors repository a list of repositories that we've generated for various vendors. And so these are connectors that can be called in real time during process execution. So as a token hits a task that is identified as running a connector, it can actually pull down the connector or an updated connector source and then execute that in real time. So this provides kind of a serverless execution model. So you may have part of your process behavior stored in code that you want to have in a code repository. And this gives you the ability to modify certain task behavior in your process outside of the process definition itself, which I think is quite interesting. I ran through that demo kind of quick, but I also wanted to show that we've done these demos in various ways with different scenarios. So if you do go to our ProcessMaker IO website, you're going to see various use cases which contain videos of pretty much the demo that I kind of walked through, but with different scenarios. And it showcases some of the connectors that we have, such as Slack, MailChimp, Adobe Sign, Form.io. So for example, if you are a form company that is presenting forms for enterprises, but now you need to add additional workflow functionality, this is a perfect example use case on how that company could do it. So that's everything from there. One thing I wanted to mention was, as Brian showed the designer, the idea behind the designer, again, is to kind of showcase an example to ISVs on how they would potentially present workflow to their customers. As Brian mentioned, if you were to expose a BPM in designer to your audience, their heads might explode. So the idea is to create a designer that fits within the context of that product. So this is an example, simple designer that we built, somewhat similar to the top-down sequential flow that, say, Microsoft Flow has, but be able to easily customize that for your specific application. I think that's basically it for our demo. I wanted to kind of open it up for questions. I know I went pretty quickly. Yes?
So in the designer, can you go back to that?
This is not a live designer, by the way. I didn't modify
So
it.
if it was live, would you, because you said it was kind of like flow, I mean, you configure it, you can execute this? Is that the idea, or is it just a picture from managers?
So the idea behind the designer, and I can actually showcase you a live designer, after hours, but the idea behind the designer is that yes, you can sequentially create your process, configure the connectors, which map to the connectors that we have, or actually embed script tasks and things like that, and immediately launch that into your workflow environment. And then immediately the process is available for execution. Yes.
So the relationship between this process and the BPMN one is so easy.
So what's interesting is the designer actually will export a BPMN file underneath. It will translate everything like this into BPMN and then use our interface to actually import that BPMN diagram. So that's basically how it does that.
So basically, the designer has to have one symbol BPMN.
Not-
BPMN was too complex.
Not necessarily. So obviously we take out a lot of the complexity of BPMN that the majority of process that people may not use off the bat. However, once you know that you need the full power of the BPMN modeling, then you could use, as Brian mentioned, any external BPMN editor, and then we would consume that.
And I think also the case that we're addressing is, I mean, if you look at the embedded designers that are out there, like in the marketing automation products, they look like that designer. The problem is those kinds of software vendors end up painting themselves into a corner, because then on comes an enterprise client that actually wants to do something more complex. So you can't really expose a BPMN designer inside Marketo or Pardot or something like that to your clients. They would just never understand it. And even I think the more sophisticated CRMs, they just don't want to have that in there. But inevitably there's the bigger clients of the world that come along. They've got something more complex. You'd like to still be able to load that up, but what we're doing there is sort of masking some of the more complex scenarios, or building that sort of approve reject loop. You don't necessarily need to show that. It's just too many lines kind of moving around in a regular BPMN diagram. It wouldn't fit for most web-based SaaS products that are the ones coming out today where we see this need.
Yes?
So I'm curious about your use of the word microservice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that just marketing? I mean, what about this?
So it can be used to kind of orchestrate your microservices. This is meant to be also, in that sense, that modular component in the cloud that you would work off of. When we design this, we kind of look at this service as a modular component of your overall strategy, whether that is orchestrating various microservices internally or external services. And then I do like to kind of label this as a microservice, even though it could be potentially designated as like an orchestration engine and such, but because it is meant to be very small in nature and not have all the extended bells and whistles, I like to categorize it as such.
Okay. I mean, I think for the entire BPMN engine in the cloud, that's what you do.
Well, we're not providing the rest of the product suite as well, so this is really meant to be the engine itself. So I consider it a fairly small component of, say, if you were to look at ProcessMaker BPM or any of the other BPM product suites out there, then it has dramatically a lot of bells and whistles. This is meant to be an extremely lean engine in there. So some people would say yes, and maybe it doesn't define as a microservice, but I feel that it is small enough of a specific purpose tool to be designated as such.
And I think if you call it a microservice router that you need to embed in your product that's a product that's transactional in nature, then you would think of that as, hey, I need something that's just going to create a route event and time that route event. So in that sense, it's not a typical delivery of a singular service via a microservice, but I guess it's all contextual, right? So in relation to the product that we're embedding it in, it is the routing microservice.
Yes?
So it's, the process could take a long time, right? So it's not a synchronous call, so I mean, is there?
It can be asynchronous. So as you are designing your process, you can designate certain components to be asynchronous in nature. And there are design patterns that we've created to kind of adopt an asynchronous model for that. So there are ways to do that with our engine. So certain tasks that may take a while if you're communicating to an external service, and that takes a very long time. Well, depending on the rest of your process map, if it's not dependent on that data, can also run asynchronously.
So like that process that you showed of the information to be deleted, I mean, that could take days, right?
That part could potentially take days. And so you would design your process to see what elements of your process map can be delivered asynchronously or be executed asynchronously, and then have that potentially be running off in another process that does take a long, that long duration for completion. So if you're looking at this process map, you can have your notification to the customer saying that we've received your request. This may take quite a long time, but obviously we threw this to basically create another process execution, which is handling that actual deletion there, and that could potentially revisit this process to do a final notification to the user. So it's based off of how you would design that process, yes. Yes?
So first, great presentation. Two questions. One, are you guys going to also offer decision tree in the cloud at some point? And the second is a more esoteric question. I don't know if there's the right answer. But do you think that integration belongs together, or do they belong outside the various steps to because I mean, I think of the other thing being responsible for go here and do this, escalate this, figure out time. And I don't have an answer to this question. I'm just curious. Clarity thought.
So really the question is, should the integrations into external services or the connectors actually be part of the engine, right? Right. And so we understand that enterprises have two scenarios, right? You might have microservices internally, and you might also have external vendors that you need to communicate with. And you will most likely be an enterprise with a mishmash of that. And so you might need to communicate with with services that are internal. And so you either have the ability to have the connectors being fired off by the BPM engine to do that, or you could potentially have workers internally that are pulling information out of the BPM engine, basically saying, okay, these are tasks that I should operate on. So this model should be flexible to support both scenarios.
And just on the decision as a service, I would say that, I mean, once you boil it down to kind of just a routing engine cloud, right, because there's no interface layer, then the line does get blurry. So we are speaking with a lot of vendors right now who are asking us for things that may be better done as a decision service. So we would certainly look to integrate something, probably partner with somebody so that you can access this, because I think the two would go very much hand in hand. And because we're not focused on the interface layer, that becomes the kind of natural next step.
Yes? We believe all users are innocent until proven guilty. No, that's absolutely true, right? Like we could, someone could potentially maliciously use the service to try and run bad code. However, we have sandboxing in place to make sure that there are limitations on the compute power. This isn't public alpha, so we actually opened up the doors to everybody to kind of help determine what those elements are. And put safeguards in. So it might be one of those situations where we are fairly restrictive on those script tasks initially, and then there might be a policy in place for vetting or just potentially opening it up based off of some sort of agreement between parties and things like that. Oh, we've definitely thought about it. So we do have internally a great deal of monitoring in place to determine what is the behavior of scripts that are being executed by people, and to kind of determine what kind of safeguards we have in place. And as we continue to evolve the product to a production deliverable, we're going to have those safeguards in place, absolutely.
All right. Taylor, Brian, thank you very much. Next up is Max. You ready to go?